What's something you wish your family would just admit already?
I had no plan to make a scene, no intention to turn a celebration into a public reckoning. And if you had asked me an hour earlier, I would have said I just wanted to get through the night without thinking about the message my parents sent that morning about not being able to afford the trip. But when they called my name for first prize and the room turned toward me and the host lifted the microphone with that expectant smile people wear when they assume your gratitude will be neat and quiet, something in me decided to stop pretending that the cost of a tank of gas and a hotel room was the problem, and I walked up there with my chest tight and my voice steady and I said, into a microphone that carried my words across the floor and into phones and memories, and maybe into the kind of conversations families avoid for years, to those who could not be bothered, this is yours too. And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt the kind of calm you only feel when you finally tell the truth. You have rehearsed in your head for so long that it has become part of the way you breathe. People think that line was a spur-of-the-moment barb, some dramatic impulse, but it came from a very plain place where facts sit beside feelings, because that same afternoon, while I was checking names on the guest list and fighting the kind of doubt that shows up when you have to pin your own name tag and pretend you are not scanning the door for faces that will not appear, my phone buzzed with a flood of photos from my aunt who has never learned to text without commentary, and there they were. My mother in a branded visor and my father with a plastic cup in his hand, leaning into my brother Michael and grinning like his second shot had put him on some leaderboard that only he believed mattered, and the caption said, "Family Day at the tournament. Proud of our champ." And underneath it my mother had commented that travel costs add up fast, but memories are priceless, which is funny if you ignore the part where she had written me earlier that flights and hotels were not in the budget and maybe next time they would plan better. It would be easy to say that I felt rage, but rage is loud and sloppy, and I have learned to live with something quieter, a steady ache that started when I was a kid and realized that praise in our house had a direction and a schedule and a price tag. So when I saw those photos, I did what I always do. I saved them to a little folder I keep for things I pretend do not hurt, and I told myself to focus on the work, on the people who showed up, on the fact that I had made something that did not ask anyone's permission to exist, and I carried that resolve like a fragile plate through the small talk and the handshakes and the harmless questions about process from people who enjoyed sounding supportive. But underneath all of it there was the memory of my mother's voice on the phone saying they wished they could come, and that times were tight, followed by my father chiming in about how maybe next season would be easier. And then there they were on a green lawn with a paid entry fee and a post-game dinner and a caption about priorities that needed no explanation. When the award announcement started, I could feel my friends squeeze my hand in that way that says they think you might actually get it, and they are ready to celebrate even if you do not, and while the host read the shortlist, my phone lit up again. This time with my brother's story showing him high-fiving some guy in a polo, and I heard myself laugh, not because it was funny, but because the loop had finally closed, the excuse and the proof sharing a timestamp like they were daring me to say nothing. So when my name came out of the speaker, I walked up with a smile that held every time I had swallowed the comment that should have been said, and I thought of all the moments I had been told to be gracious and keep it in the family. And I realized that families who ask for silence are usually asking for permission to keep doing what they are doing without consequences. I need you to understand that the sentence I spoke into the mic was not a dagger, it was a mirror, because I did not call anyone out by name, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not even look angry. I simply offered the truth in a way that let anyone who recognized themselves in it decide how guilty they felt, and the room, which had been buzzing with the light noise of people waiting for an open bar, went still for a beat that felt long enough for a lifetime to sit down, and then the applause came, not wild or messy, but steady and warm, the kind of sound that tells you other people have their own versions of the same story and are relieved that someone finally said hers out loud. By the time I stepped off the stage, my phone was jumping with messages from friends who could not be there and from a cousin who wrote that my mother had just shared another picture from the 18th hole, and I smiled because the universe has a mean sense of timing. And then the tone changed and a text slid in from my father saying, "We saw a clip of your speech. Let us talk later," which is the kind of phrase that tries to sound reasonable while holding a threat by the tail, and after that, Michael's name popped up with a single line that said, "What was that?" And I stared at it long enough to feel a choice rise inside me. The old choice to explain and apologize, to make everyone comfortable again, or the new choice to let the discomfort sit where it belonged. I put the phone face down and I thanked strangers for believing in my work, and I answered a question about the piece that just won, and while I did that I kept thinking about costs, not the price of a plane ticket or a hotel, but the cost of being the one who keeps the peace by paying in silence, and for the first time it seemed foolish, like picking up a tab for a dinner you were not even invited to. And I realized that the line I had spoken was only the beginning of the bill arriving at the right table. What I did not tell anyone in that moment, not even my closest friend who was reading my face like a weather map, was that I had already sent something out earlier that afternoon. A little action I took when I saw the golf photos and felt that calm anger settle in, and it was simple and clean and exactly the kind of thing my family would call unnecessary if they knew about it, which is why I did not say a word about it at the exhibit. Because some moves do not need noise to land, and as the night wound down and the congratulations turned into hugs and the curator asked me to step aside for a photo, my brother stopped replying. My parents went quiet, and I understood that silence works both ways. There's a shield and mine a fuse. And if you are wondering whether the fuse was already burning, I will tell you this much, and nothing more right now. It was, and the spark had already found what it needed. If I tell you that the line into the mic came from years of being the understudy in my own family, you might think I am exaggerating, yet every story I could pull from the shelf has the same spine, the same note in the margin that says "make room for Michael." And even when I did not mind sharing because he is my brother, and I loved him in the uncomplicated way you love the first person who steals your snacks and still makes you laugh, it became a grind that wore down the parts of me that needed someone to say keep going, because you are not a hobby, you are not the extra, you are allowed to take up space without apologizing for it. When I think about how it started, I go back to school nights where awards were treated like weather reports, something you acknowledge on your way to the car, and if the event was his. We stayed for cake and photos and a long dinner with relatives who told him he was the center of something big, while if the event was mine. We slipped out after the polite clapping, and my mother said we needed to beat traffic, and my father said early mornings were easier when you did not turn them into celebrations, and none of that felt like cruelty then. It felt like habit, until habits turned into rules and rules turned into a script where Michael was the point and I was the understory. They paid for his lessons because skills are investments, they said, and they bought his gear because performance deserves support, and when I asked for a summer program at the museum my mother said art is wonderful but money is real. And I promised myself I would stop bringing it up because begging for your own life gets old, and so I made do with secondhand supplies and borrowed studio time, and I learned to build my own network the way you learn to carry heavy boxes when no one else can lift them. You do it because the alternative is letting your things sit in the hallway forever, and I do not resent the muscle that gave me, but I do resent the way it taught them I would always figure it out without them. Even in the small adult moments, the pattern held its shape, like when Michael's car needed a repair and my parents called me to ask if I knew a good shop and then, without missing a beat, asked if I could spot him until payday because they were helping with his tournament fees, and when I said I could not they sighed like I was being unkind, and then my father reminded me that family takes care of family. Which is true until you notice the definition of family seems to shift whenever the topic is me, and maybe that sounds bitter, but it is just the accounting I had to do to stay sane. So when the week of the exhibit arrived and I sent them the invitation and the links and the schedule and the list of hotels the gallery had negotiated discounts with, and my mother called with that soft voice she uses when she wants to make refusal feel like concern, telling me that travel was too much this month and that they would be cheering from home, I swallowed the familiar taste of disappointment and said I understood, because I did not feel like opening the ledger again. And then the same day I saw them at the tournament, not just attending but posted up with matching passes and drinks and a joke about how the entry fee had been worth it just to watch Michael sink a putt that apparently made a grown man clap like a child. And I am telling you this not to paint them as villains, but to be honest about the exact frame of mind I was in when I decided to stop playing the part they had written for me. The quiet action I hinted at earlier was not fireworks, It was an email to the curator at midday with a simple request to update the placard for the piece that would end up winning. Because for weeks it had carried a dedication line, I wrote back when I still hoped the title would make them feel seen, and I asked that it be replaced with a line that said, "For everyone who showed up even when it was inconvenient," which to some people probably reads like a general thank you, but to me felt like putting the light where it belonged. And I also told the coordinator that if any extra guest passes were still open, I wanted them transferred to two people who had been there for me without questions. My high school art teacher and the neighbor kid who helps me ship prints and thinks the world is bigger than his paycheck, and the coordinator replied within minutes that it would be done and congratulations in advance, which felt like someone, somewhere, was willing to act without asking me to justify myself. I could have kept that to myself forever and it would have been enough, honestly, because there is something clean about redirecting the spotlight instead of arguing about who refused to stand under it. But I will admit there was a petty part of me that enjoyed watching Mrs. Alvarez and her husband step into the reception with the two passes that used to be mentally reserved for my parents, and there was a stronger, truer part of me that watched the neighbor kid look like his life had cracked open just a little because someone believed he belonged in that room, and that, more than any speech, was the first click of the lock turning in a door I had been trapped behind for a long time. You wanted revenge in every episode, and I hear you, because a neat moral is not what anyone tunes in for, and this was my move for this chapter. Not loud, not cruel, but precise. A redistribution of access and credit away from the people who said they could not be bothered and toward the ones who bothered even when it did not benefit them, and if you think that is small, ask anyone who has spent a lifetime waiting for a chair that keeps getting saved for someone else, and you will see how powerful it feels to hand that chair to a person who shows up without conditions. There was a second part too, one that set the stage for everything that came after, because while I was changing the placard and shifting the passes, I drafted a short statement that the gallery could include in any press follow-up, a clean, simple line about showing up and what it means when people you love choose not to, and I sent it before the doors opened, which meant the quote existed before the win, and as soon as my speech started to circulate that night, the gallery's publicist had the line ready to go, and she asked if she could pair it with a photo of me holding the award, and I said she could, and that was the moment the story stopped being a private bruise and started being something with its own legs. Because within an hour Michael stopped answering messages, and my mother's last comment under his tournament photo disappeared, and my father sent a careful text about how feelings were running high and maybe this was not the right way to handle them, and I stared at the screen and thought about all the wrong ways I had already tried, and I chose not to reply, because the next step was already on the calendar, and if they thought the placard and the passes and the quote were the whole plan, they were not ready for what came when the clip hit a very specific inbox and a very specific conversation about money finally landed where it should. People love to imagine revenge as a single dramatic swing, but the truth is I did not throw a punch. I rearranged the furniture, and by the time anyone noticed, the room felt different enough that they had to choose between tripping over their own habits or learning a new way to walk, which is why, after I changed the placard and rerouted the guest passes, I opened my laptop and sent the clip of my acceptance line to two places that would understand exactly what I meant without me spelling it out. First to the alumni coordinator at my old high school who had been emailing me for months begging for an artist to visit, because all the seniors ever heard were talks from athletes. And second to the local arts reporter who had been sniffing around the exhibit for a human angle, but needed permission to use my words without worrying that I would fold when my family pushed back, and in both cases my note was short and clean. Something like this is about showing up. If you want it, you have it. And here is the line exactly as I said it, and within an hour the coordinator wrote back that if I was willing to attach my name she would love to announce a small scholarship at the school assembly the following week, something called the ShowUp Award, for a kid who keeps creating even when their support system is thin, and I said yes on the condition that the award include 2 reserved seats to the recipient's next event for whoever actually shows up for them, not symbolic seats for parents who cannot make it, but real chairs for the people who are there, and she said that was the best part. If you are doing the math, you might be wondering where the money came from, because art prizes are not always cash, and I am not a magician. And here is the part one had not told you because I am embarrassed by how long I played along. A few weeks earlier, I had agreed to float a portion of Michael's new gear because our parents said it would help him break through the season, and because I was tired of being the difficult one, which is how you end up agreeing to things that make you swallow your own needs like pills you cannot afford, but the gear was on layaway at a specialty shop and the final payment had not gone through. So when the coordinator said the scholarship could be real if there was real money, I pulled up my email to the shop and wrote a clear, polite message canceling my part of the purchase, asking for my deposit to be refunded, and copying Michael and my parents so it could not be spun later as a misunderstanding, and I explained, without drama, that I was reallocating those funds to support a student artist at the high school, and I thanked the shop for their understanding and wished them a good week, because there is power in sounding calm when you know people will call you selfish 5 minutes later. I could hear your intake of breath from here if you have ever been told to keep the peace, because this is the kind of move that looks small on a spreadsheet but lands like a slap in a conversation, and I braced for the messages, which came right on schedule. My mother with a sweet opener about being proud of me, followed by a pivot into how unfair this felt to my brother, because commitments matter, and my father with a practical note about timelines and reputations, and then Michael with a kind of short, hot text that tries to pin you to a wall by refusing to use verbs, and I read them all and did not reply, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because answering would turn the decision into a debate. And debates in our family are not about the thing on the table, they're about keeping a hierarchy in place, and I was not interested in that architecture anymore. Here is the part that made me laugh, not because it is funny, but because the symmetry was too perfect. An hour after I sent that cancellation, the arts reporter called and asked if the line I said on stage had been inspired by anything specific. And I told her the truth without names, that my parents had texted about not being able to afford to attend that day, and then posted happy photos from my brother's tournament, and she went quiet for a beat and said she had her angle, an exhibit about work and worth and who chooses to be in the room when it finally pays off, and she asked if she could include my plan for the ShowUp scholarship as a counterpoint, and I said she could, but only if the piece made it clear that the point was not to punish anyone. It was to reward the kind of people who climb the stairs with you even when there is no ribbon at the top, and she said that line would be her closer, which felt like someone across town had just pushed open a window I had been staring at for years. I know you want me to say I felt triumphant right then, and part of me did. Because every long look I gave myself in bathroom mirrors after family dinners where my achievements were treated like appetizers had built to this moment where I stopped asking for permission to eat. But there was another part of me that worried I was burning bridges I might want later, and I had to sit with that for a while, because you do not shake off a lifetime of being the reasonable one in one day. You do it by acting like the person you wish your younger self had seen, and then you wait to see if the sky falls, and when it does not, you take another step, which is why I did one more thing before the night ended. A thing that looked like a souvenir, but was really a message written in plain language for anyone who wanted to read it. I ordered 3 framed prints of the photo the gallery took of me holding the award with the microphone in my other hand. Not the fancy shot with the stage lights and the handshake, but the candid one where I look like I just said something I believe and am prepared to live with the fallout, and I asked the print shop to add a small line at the bottom that said to those who could not be bothered, "This is yours too," and I set the delivery addresses to my parents' house, my brother's apartment, and the high school office with a note asking the coordinator to hang it in the art room, and then I closed the laptop and let the automation do what it does best, quietly, precisely, without requiring me to offer explanations I no longer owed. If you want an immediate explosion, I cannot give you that here, because sometimes the best blow lands with a delay. It asks the other person to sit in their own reflection and decide how loud they want to make their embarrassment. And I knew there was still one more lever to pull, one that would make it impossible to reframe what happened as a misunderstanding or a phase, and it had nothing to do with social media and everything to do with the exact bank account that had been used for years to keep Michael's hobby looking like a career, a joint arrangement I had agreed to back when saying yes felt like the only way to stay included, and I had a meeting on the calendar with the branch manager for the next morning. which means the next thing I did would not just be symbolic or public, it would be structural. And if you were wondering whether he knew by then, I will tell you only this before we step into it together. By the time the sun came up, my brother had stopped posting, my parents had stopped calling, and a very specific automatic transfer was about to stop as well. The meeting at the bank was not dramatic, and that is exactly why it worked. Because I walked in with a folder that held the original paperwork for the joint transfer we set up years ago, when keeping things smooth felt like the only way to get through holidays without a fight. And I sat down with the branch manager who remembered me by name, because I have been the responsible one for as long as I can remember, and I said I wanted to terminate the automatic transfer and remove my authorization from any linked accounts that were not mine, and he asked the standard questions to make sure I was not acting under pressure, and I told him the truth, that I was acting under clarity. And he nodded like he had seen this exact kind of clarity before and printed the forms and slid them across the desk for my signature, and I signed without shaking because the hard part had already happened at the microphone the night before. If you are wondering what the transfer was for, I will tell you without dressing it up. It was a monthly draft into a shared pot my parents called the family support account, which sounds generous until you notice where the support kept landing. Because once the mortgage scare ended years ago and the debts were paid, the account quietly evolved into a pipeline for entry fees, travel, equipment, and all the extras that turned my brother's hobby into a lifestyle, and every time I tried to reframe it as a time-limited boost, I got speeches about belief and loyalty, and when I asked whether any of it could be redirected to the studio or to shipping costs or to anything that kept my work moving, the answer was a smile and a phrase about how art is flexible and sports are time-sensitive, which is a polite way to say we can keep asking you to carry this, because you will not drop it. So I dropped it in the only place you are allowed to drop something without playing a scene, on a form that says, effective immediately. The manager asked whether I wanted to notify the other parties, and I said the copy on the email would do that, because I knew what would happen if I called. The conversation would slide from money to gratitude to tone to history. And none of that would change the line on the ledger that says the transfer has been stopped, so I wrote a short note and attached the confirmation and said that moving forward, any support I offer will be direct, time-bound, and tied to specific goals, and then I closed the laptop, thanked the manager, and walked out into a day that looked exactly the same as the day before, except I was no longer subsidizing someone else's comfort at the cost of my own. This is where the fallout starts to develop its own timing, because an hour after the bank email went out, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother that said she wished I had discussed this with them first, and that there were better ways to handle disappointment. And then my father followed with a message about family optics and how my choice could create tension at gatherings, and then Michael chimed in with a line that tried to sound calm, but read like a clenched jaw, and I did not answer any of them, not because I wanted to punish them, but because we have done decades of talking and almost no changing. And I wanted the change to stand on its own feet for once without me dragging it to the finish line with explanations that only teach people how to argue me back into place. Meanwhile, the reporter's piece went live with the exact framing we discussed, a short story about showing up that did not name my family, but did not protect the excuse either. And the comments filled with people who had their own versions of the same experience and who understood the difference between being busy and being unwilling. And among those comments were 2 from old neighbors and 1 from my mother's cousin who wrote that he wished he had brought his daughter to more recitals, and I cannot lie, that one got me, because sometimes the only way a person hears a truth is when it arrives from a distance dressed in someone else's words. I want to tell you about Michael here because it matters. He sent me a long message that tried to rewrite the last few years as a team effort where we all made sacrifices for his shot, and how cruel it was to throw this away when he was so close. And I read it and felt the usual mix of old love and new anger, because I have sat through so many family dinners where his next chance was the main course and everything else was garnish, and I typed out a reply and deleted it and typed another and deleted that too, because anything I said would become evidence that this was personal rather than structural, and the structure had been changed already, so I left it at scene and let the reality sit, and by the time the evening rolled around, His social feeds went quiet, and a friend who was at the club messaged me that he left early and seemed rattled, and I will not pretend that did not land somewhere deep in me with a mix of sadness and satisfaction, because both can be true. I can love my brother and still refuse to keep making the same deposit into a story that never pays me back. Here is where the next move came into focus, not out of spite but out of relief, because once the money stopped flowing, I realized how much of my time had been spent managing emotions around that flow. So I spent that freed energy on something that felt like air in my lungs. I sat down and wrote a formal thank you to the gallery, to the curator, to the volunteers, to my teacher, and to the neighbor kid. And at the end of each note, I added the same sentence that would either be read as graceful or as pointed depending on who you were. I wrote that showing up is a choice, and that I am done rewarding people who choose not to, and I meant every word. And then I did one last thing that set the table for what came next. I accepted the high school's invitation to announce the first ShowUp award at the next assembly, and I asked the coordinator to keep 2 seats empty in the front row with placards that said reserved for the ones who came anyway. And I did not tell my parents about that event, because the point was not to convert them, it was to honor the people who never needed converting. By late night, the framed prints had arrived at my brother's building according to the tracking email, and another notice said the package had been delivered at my parents' house and signed for, and still no one called, which told me exactly how the next scene would play out. Because when people go quiet after being confronted with a reflection, it usually means they are circling the wagons and hunting for a new story that does not require them to change anything, and that is why I said yes when my mother's sister invited me to a family lunch that weekend, because I knew there would be a kitchen counter and a sealed frame and a silence that said everything they were not ready to say out loud, and I was ready to bring the last piece I had held back. The one I chose as the final move, not because it would humiliate anyone, but because it would end the argument for good by putting the truth in a place they could not avoid. And if you think that sounds like a scene, it was not a spectacle. It was a document, and it had my father's signature on it from years ago, and the moment I placed it on the table, the room would have to pick a side. I went to my aunt's house knowing exactly what I was going to do, and also knowing I would not raise my voice, because the power was not in volume anymore. It was in the one thing my family respects when it suits them, which is paperwork. So I arrived with a plain envelope in my bag, and the kind of steady calm you get when you have already accepted that some bridges are worth burning if the smoke finally signals where you stand, and after the greetings and the careful small talk and the way my mother looked at the framed print still sealed on the counter like it might explode if she touched it, I asked if we could sit for a minute at the kitchen table, and I slid the envelope to the middle like it was a shared bill after an expensive dinner. And I said, this is the form we signed years ago when we opened the account we called Family Support, and here is the line that says the funds are for emergencies only and will be reviewed every year together, and here is your signature, Dad. Right next to mine, and here, highlighted because I am done pretending it is invisible, is the clause that says any use beyond the emergency window needs new consent from both parties, which you never asked for and which I would not have given. And I watched my father's face do that little twitch it does when the story he planned to tell hits a wall made of his own words. I did not ask for an apology because apologies in my family often mean nothing beyond resetting the cycle, so I kept going in the same even voice, and I said I have already closed the transfer and removed my authorization, which you know from the email. And I am not here to negotiate or revisit or explain. I am here to put the purpose back where it belonged in the first place. And then I pulled out a second sheet, not dramatic, just clean, and I said this is a letter of intent I have already sent to the high school coordinator and the gallery, which states that the exact amount I have contributed to the family account over the past years will be matched over time in the form of the ShowUp Fund, an award for students who keep creating when the people closest to them choose not to stand in the room. And since we once called this a family support account, I am offering you the chance to be listed as supporters on the scholarship plaque. Not because I need your money, but because names carry weight. And if you want your names under the word show up, then you can sign here. And if you do not want your names under those words, you can leave it blank. But either way, the fund exists and the money moves where it should have been moving all along, which is toward people who actually show up. My mother reached for the paper like it might cut her, and then pulled her hand back, and my father asked if we really needed to drag other people into this, which made my aunt laugh in that sharp way that breaks the precious hush we have all worked too hard to keep. And she said other people are already in it. You put them there every time you posted a victory lap and called it family. And I let the silence sit because silence has been their shield, and it can be mine too when I choose it, and Michael finally came in from the yard with the expression he wears when he is trying to pretend none of this is his problem, and he glanced at the sealed frame, and then at the letter, and then at me. And for a second I saw the kid I used to build forts with before everything turned into a scoreboard, and I said I canceled my portion of your gear. You saw the message, I know that hurts. I also know you're a grown man who can ask your sponsors to believe in you the way you have expected me to. Believe in you, and if they believe in you, great, and if they do not, then that is information, and it is not my job to make that information softer. No one shouted, which felt stranger than shouting would have, and I took that as a sign that the old script was losing pages. So I stood up and slid a stamped envelope across the table and said, if you decide you want your names on that plaque, sign the copy and drop it in the mail, and if you do not, that is also a decision, and I picked up the sealed, framed photo and set it upright against the backsplash, as if it were just another kitchen thing that belonged there, and my aunt reached behind me and clicked a magnet onto the envelope to hold it in place, and I kissed her cheek and said I had another event to get to. Which was true because the assembly was the next day, and I had promised a kid that I would stand in a room and say out loud what it means when someone shows up. The assembly was held in the same auditorium where I once sat through sports banquets that felt like holidays while my art club meetings were treated like errands, and when I walked onto the stage, the coordinator had done exactly what I asked. 2 front-row seats held with placards that read reserved for the ones who came anyway, and in those seats sat Mrs. Alvarez and the neighbor kid, and when I announced the first recipient of the ShowUp award, a quiet junior who had been helping his grandmother and still bringing charcoal sketches to every critique, I looked to those placards, and then to the students' 2 guests, a bus driver from his route who always asked about his work and a friend who worked nights stocking shelves, but still came to every school show. And I handed him the envelope and said that the award was not just money, it was a promise that if the people you expect choose not to stand up for you, others will, and the applause landed like a hug I did not expect. And I will be honest, I went home and cried for a long time, not out of sadness, out of relief. Later that afternoon my phone buzzed with 3 messages that told me everything I needed to know without me asking for it. My brother's was the first, and it was almost nothing, just a line that said I get it, which is the closest he has ever come to an apology. And then my father's came through with a sentence about how they would like to attend the next exhibit and that they would cover their own flights and hotel, followed by a careful request to talk when I was ready, and then my mother's note arrived last with a photo of the framed print now unsealed and hanging on a wall I know too well, and underneath she wrote that the wording stung, but that it belongs here, and I stared at those messages and felt the shape of my life shift, not because everything was fixed. It was not because they suddenly deserved a parade, they did not, but because the conversation had finally moved to the right ground, and I had drawn the lines with actions instead of pleas, and once you do that, you do not have to police them, you just keep walking. I did reply, not with a speech, just with terms. I wrote that they were welcome to come if they bought their tickets and kept the conversation about my work at the center rather than their feelings, and I wrote that I was not coming home to referee. And I wrote that I would not be funding anyone's hobbies anymore, and that if they wanted their names on the scholarship plaque, I needed the signed letter by the end of the month. And then I put my phone down and looked at my own wall where another copy of the framed photo leaned against the shelf waiting for a nail, and I realized I no longer needed it hung to feel seen. Because the proof was already out there in the scholarship account, and the bank forms, and the absence of that automatic debit that used to feel like a leash, and the only sound in the room was my own breath settling. If you are waiting for me to say I forgave everyone that second, I did not, and if you are waiting for me to admit I went too far, I will not, because I did not hurt anyone to make this point. I simply stopped paying for their comfort with my silence and my money, and I gave something better to someone who would use it to climb. And when I think about the sentence I said into the mic, I know now it was not a jab, it was a rerouting slip. A little form that moved the energy where it belonged. And that is the part that feels like winning, not over my family, though it certainly knocked the wind out of their favorite story, but over the version of me who thought keeping the peace meant giving myself away, and if there is a lingering conflict, let it linger. Because the last move has already been made and the board looks different, and whether they learn to play on it is up to them, not me.